come to Mine Services to do a hydraulic hose assembly, the first thing we have to do is go through what we call the stamped process, which should be across anybody who's manufacturing hose assemblies, which basically you would have seen in the picture in the first part just before this video started. So it goes through the size, what's the size of the hose, with the hose height, and hoses are always measured in internal diameter. The temperature range. Some hoses only have a limited temperature range, and we would have a specific hose, for instance, for a high temperature application. So in particular, if it's going near hot surfaces or whatever, we would then also define what it is in terms of the temperature resistance of that hose, either for the fluid going through it or the outside environment that the hose is operating in. The application, so the type of service for the hose assembly. The material or media that's going through the hose. So some hydraulic hoses have hydraulic fluids may not be compatible with some of the hydraulic hoses depending on the tube that it has. And so, for instance, you know, if you were looking at an industrial hose as an example, you obviously can't use a standard water hose for transporting fuel because the tube would delaminate and fail prematurely. The pressure, obviously the pressure that the assembly will be operating at. So it can be anything from a low pressure 400 psi in a hydraulic system on a return line up to very high pressure up to 6,000 psi, dependent on the application. What ends have to go on the end of the hose, so is it GIC, what termination is required on the fitting to connect, to be able to transfer the fluid, and then the delivery. So when who's going to collect it, when it needs to be delivered, and so on. So we go through this process of the first part of when you come in to establish what it is you need and when you need it. At Mine Services, what we do different to everyone else is we only use matched hose and fittings to ensure that you have a properly engineered assembly that will work for the use you're putting it to. So we don't just buy a hose from one person and then a fitting from someone else and put it together. We actually do, for the hoses and fittings the hose assemblies that we make, we actually pressure test. We actually crimp and then we pressure test up to 4 times the safe working pressure the hose assembly to ensure it will perform effectively over many years of service. So this is not something we take for granted, because most hoses are manufactured to an SE specifications, and in the manufacturing process, the hose diameter can vary from anything from 20 to 40 thou. For a proper crimp of a fitting, once you have crimp specifications, you only allow plus or minus 5 thousandths of an inch to ensure that fitting is correctly crimped based on the crimp specs. So if I was to go and buy a hose from Goodyear and a fitting from Parker and put them together, I have no guarantee that assembly will work without pressure testing to make sure it will retain on the assembly. That's why here at Mines we only use matched hoses with fittings designed to work with that particular manufacturer of hose, and based on our testing, pressure testing of that to more than 4 times the design working pressure of that assembly. So we actually have an in-house pressure tester that pressure tests up to 30,000 psi. So we can actually blow 6,000 psi hose. So that would theoretically blow at just over 24,000 psi. We can actually blow the hose with our pressure test unit that we have here. Again, like I said, we match the hose and the fitting. And what we have here is basically a braided hose. This is a SA100R2 AT hose in 3/4 inch, which this hose is. The working pressure is 3,100 psi, and then we match that with 43 series bite wire coupling that we know works with this hose. And if you can see, this is what we call a braided hose here. So you can clearly see it. So typically, braided hoses are normally used in medium pressure applications. So anything up to 3 and maybe up to 4,000 psi in smaller sizes, but as you get larger, the pressure obviously drops. So in 3/4 inches is 3,100 psi, and this is a 2-wire braid coupling. And This is a fitting that we use for these 2-wire hoses. As a comparison, when we go to the same size hose, spiral hose, and this is a 4SH12, so it's 3/4 inch, 6,100 PSI hose if you look at the ley line. And you can see the construction of the wire in it, and the reinforcement is much heavier and is much finer, much more finely wrapped than the braided hose, which allows it to basically be able to carry a much higher pressure, right? And again, the fitting, if we go back and compare the two, one for the braided hose, this is for the braided hose, and this is for the spiral hose, the SH hose. If you look at it, you can see that it's a much larger fitting, which obviously has a lot more clamping force on the hose assembly to handle that higher pressure application. All of these hoses and fittings are matched and tested to work together. When we test it, we come up with a crimp specification that we know can, with crimp specification, that is then entered into the crimper with the correct die to crimp that hose to the correct final crimp outside diameter. We have the crimp specs here, crimp specification that specifies the hose, the fitting that we're using here, right? The die number for the crimper that we're using, and then the approximate crimp setting on the crimper, and then the final crimp diameter, which when we crimp it using the right die and the right crimp setting, we should come back to within plus or minus 5/1000ths of an inch of this final crimp diameter. And after that, we then take a certified caliper that's checked, that's calibrated caliper that's calibrated every year and certified every year to check that final crimp OD to ensure that it conforms to what the desired crimp specification is. So there's no guesswork in this. This is an engineered assembly. This way we can be confident that this hose going out there will last you a long time. You know, we've had in the past, you know, we have a hose tracking system. So when a hose comes through here, it's manufactured on a job card. So if you notice here, the job card number with who the customer is, the invoice number, the job card number, and what was used to manufacture that hose is then entered and actually tagged on the hose. So I'll show you an example of that. If you notice here, the hose is tagged, each hose is tagged with its own individual serial number, which gives the hose size, date of manufacture, and it also quotes the job card number that the hose was manufactured on. So we can now, with that number, we can actually manufacture that hose back for you from that serial number. So it also allows you on your equipment, each hose is individually serial numbered, so you can keep track of it. Sometimes things do go missing. Or you can also take that number and call us up and we can manufacture a new hose assembly. So if you're in the bush, you know, in Tiparu Back Dam, you don't have to send that hose out by road. It may take 2 or 3 days and then wait for us to manufacture. Then it takes another 3 days to get back in there. You can just call it in on your radio, or by phone if you have phone access, and we can manufacture a new hose assembly, which obviously cuts the time that you can get back in operation. This system with the hose tracking also lets us know what the date of manufacture is. So we have a 6-month warranty on any hose assembly we make, and this way it can tell you when the hose was actually manufactured. So if there's a failure within the period of time, you, the customer yourself, can actually go and check it and come back to us if it's something that's failed within the warranty period. Now, we've been, over the last 2 years, we've been tracking 7,000 hose assemblies, and of that, we've only had one failure due to an error on the part of the technician. All our hose technicians are NAHAD certified, which is the certifying body for the hose industry in the US. So all our technicians are NAHAD certified and trained to be able to assess what hose you need, what fittings you need at the end, and manufacture the hose to our specifications and to suit your application. So it'll give you a long life. At Mine Services, we also have a documented hose division standard operating procedure, which outlines all the steps that I've just gone through with you previously. And this is, we actually audit on a monthly basis with our quality quality health and safety officer to ensure conformance to these standards and to the process. So the idea is that you can ideally feel confident in what you get from us will work and will last a long time in service. I mean, we know, I personally go all over the interior. I know the conditions of the roads, and in particular, the mining community have to go through to get into their operations, and it can be nothing more frustrating than when you get in there, you put on a hose, and that hose assembly blows. But yet still, we see a lot of people still trying to go cheap on a hose assembly and try to save $5,000 or $10,000 on a hose assembly by using an old stem and a new ferrule. As I said earlier, there's no guarantees that I cannot guarantee that that will work. So that's why we at Mine Services do not actually manufacture any hose assembly with an old stem and new ferrules. And you know, I think it's also being a bit penny wise and pound foolish, in the sense that if you have a hose assembly go on an excavator, you're losing a drum of hydraulic oil, which is $160,000, and then you're losing days of production in many instances, and the downtime that causes on your machinery. Frustration for the people working there because they get paid on production, and if they can't get production because hoses keep failing, then that drives a lot of stress for the owner in the operation. You know, we have a ranch and we run a timber operation, so we understand what our customers go through when things do not perform as they're supposed to. You know, that's why we put all these procedures, systems in place to ensure we can provide a consistent, engineered hose assembly that will work, give you a long service life on whatever application you use it. Thank you.